Dear students, let me now demonstrate to you how to assess the bleeding on probing in a patient. For this, I will be demonstrating to you papillary bleeding index given by Milliman in 1977. According to this papillary bleeding index, you have to take a WHO probe or any periodontal probe. And you can see this is the papilla, interdental papilla. This index assesses the bleeding in the papillary areas. Okay, so you need to insert the probe into the papilla sulcus, right? You can observe the blanching as the probe goes into the base of the sulcus, and then you can take it out. Yes, you can observe there is a bleeding noticed in the area. Now, you can also see after you probe into the distal part of the papilla, next you continue probing on the mesial part of the papilla. Okay, and you can wait 30 to 60 seconds to elicit the bleeding. Meanwhile, you can go on continuing your probing on the other papilla, distally and mesially also, until reaching the base of the sulcus. Once you finish probing all the papilla here, okay, for example, as I show in 3 to 4 areas, you wait for 30 to 60 seconds and you score as per the scoring criteria, which are 0 means absolutely no bleeding. 1 is only one isolated bleeding point is present. 2 is many isolated bleeding points or a line bleeding. Here, entire line bleeding on the gingival margin can be can be present. Interdental triangle could be this embrasure space. If it is completely filled up with the blood, it is score 3. And if there is a profuse bleeding upon probing, and even the blood from the marginal spreads from the interdental embrasure space, the entire marginal gingiva, that could be a score of 4. Now let us try to apply the scoring to the bleeding that is seen in this case. As you see here, the bleeding here, when we probed and taken out, now you can see the bleeding point is here and the bleeding point is only restricted to the embrasure space. But it is not an isolated bleeding point, rather it could be 2 or 3 bleeding points. Hence, I can give a score of 2 in this situation. For the next unit of papilla, there is only one isolated bleeding point. There is no further bleeding anywhere. So this could be a score of 1. Even here, there is only one isolated bleeding point. Hence, the score could be 1. In this case, the entire interdental triangle is almost filled up with the embrasure space, is almost filled up with the blood. It's not too heavy, but it is there. So I will give a score of 3 in this situation. So like this, you will actually assess the severity of bleeding using the papillary bleeding index. Now let me show you the same bleeding on probing assessment on the lower anterior teeth. As you can see, I am using my probe parallel to the long axis and inserting into the base of the sulcus. You can observe the blanching of the gingiva, and then you can take out. Then do the same mesial half of the papilla, go inside and come out here. Yes, go on in 3 sides and verify whether there is a bleeding present or not. As I said, you can wait 30 to 60 seconds to elicit the bleeding score. But you can see, for example, in this area, you cannot really appreciate any bleeding as of now. Maybe as you wait, it may come up in a bleeding spot. But if there is no bleeding spot as observed, it could be a score of 0. Here, there is isolated bleeding point only on one area. So this could be a score of 1. Here, you can see 2 bleeding points, right? So if multiple bleeding points are present, too many, then we can give a score of 2. So if this could be either 1, I believe it can still be score of 1 because it's too less to consider score 2. Okay, now you can see there's nice bleeding up, popping up, as you can see here. Yes, it is trying to flow from the papilla to the marginal gingiva, right? It is not completely have flown, but it is trying to so. So this could be a score of 2 also, because there's papillary bleeding point here and here, and is also flowing. So this can be considered a score 2 bleeding. So in this fashion, you actually evaluate the severity of bleeding perceived in the patient.
Now let us see how to assess a bleeding score in a patient. Assessment of bleeding score is very important because it signifies the amount of gingival inflammation present in the patient. Bleeding score also helps us to differentiate whether the case has got healthy gingiva, is it a healthy gingiva, or it is a gingivitis present, so or if it is a generalized gingivitis present. Even based on the new classification system, if 10% or more is a bleeding score, then you call it as a gingivitis or localized gingivitis. For generalized gingivitis, the amount of bleeding score must be 30%. So how to assess bleeding in the patient? For this, of course, you normally do for all the full mouth bleeding score. So you usually assess in all the surfaces. You retract the cheek of the patient. You start from the distalmost point usually, which is the molars, and then you go onto the all the facial surfaces like this. When you are running the probe, you have to run the probe while you are doing that, which I will show you now. For recording purpose, to make it clearly visible to you, I start from the central incisors here. Okay, you take your periodontal probe, Williams periodontal probe or any other periodontal probe, and you start probing at the sulcus of the distalmost part of the teeth, and then you run 1 mm into the sulcus like this. Okay, you just go on, carry with a gentle pressure, no much pressure, carry the probe lightly 1 mm within the sulcus. You can go on like this. So you can wait until 30 seconds, even up to 60 seconds sometimes, in order to elicit whether the bleeding comes there or not, or the bleeding point seen or not. If there is bleeding present, you can record it as positive, or you can put 1, a score of 1. If there is no bleeding, then it will be a score of 0. Now, which surfaces we should evaluate? On the buccal or the facial aspect, you will evaluate on 3 surfaces. One is mesial, mid-buccal, and distal. On the palatine, once you finish all the facial surfaces probing, you go continuously on the palatal surface. You run the probe palatally like this and come back to the distalmost point where you have started. So palatally is only mid-palatal surface. So total is 4 surfaces. Mesial, I repeat, distal, mid-buccal, mesial and palatal. Sometimes when you record for periodontal charting in a periodontitis patient, bleeding can be assessed even on the 6 points, like 3 points on the buccal and 3 points on the palatal also. But for regular patients, generally for all the other purposes, any patient, whenever you are checking, you can check on the 4 surfaces like 1, 2, 3 and 4. Once you probe and run the probe along the gingiva sulcus 1 mm like this, then you assess the probing. As you can see here, now if at all, what is the score for this particular tooth? If you observe, you can see here there is 0, here is 1 because bleeding is seen, here is 0. Whereas for the tooth 2-1, it is 1, 1 and again 0. So this is how you actually score if it is on the 3 sides. Palatally we didn't probe, so I am not checking. So otherwise for the completion of the tooth, you also have to verify palatally also. I hope it's clear.